Hi everyone, this is the video lecture on the Immigrant Landscape, New York City's Lower East Side. And this lecture fits with our treatment of America during the Progressive Era. And we begin with the subject of immigration. Inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty, maybe America's most iconic landmark, are the words from a poem written by a Jewish American named Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It stands as a statement enshrined on our most famous Statue of Liberty to the general disposition of America in its history to welcome the peoples of the world, the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And you have to stand back for a second to appreciate just how significant was the period of immigration that followed the American Civil War. Because in addition to the destruction of slavery as a result of that war, in which nearly 3.5 million slaves became freed people, by comparison, an even more enormous population transformation occurred in the quarter century or so that defines the period that we are now studying. 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States between 1876 and 1914. And when you put the two together, both the destruction of slavery and the enormous immigration, what you get is nothing short of a social revolution in this country that will fundamentally transform the American population. And it seems natural to ask, how would the nation respond? Would we become, as suggested by the words on the Statue of Liberty, would we become a melting pot of peoples, a nation of assimilated immigrants whose identities merge with the mainstream culture of American society? It's often true that we proclaim ourselves to be a melting pot nation. But it seems reasonable to ask whether or not that ideal of assimilation is found to be true in practice. This was, after all, the age of Jim Crow, and we've become accustomed to talking about and learning about the nature of racial segregation. But in what sense, then, did the immigrant people either challenge or conform to that same basic pattern of segregation? If in fact immigrants came to America and rather than finding themselves somehow melted into a mainstream of culture, persisted as separate and apart, then we could say of America it was less a melting pot and perhaps more of a mosaic. What we're going to do here is to take a look at one famous example of an immigrant's landscape, the Lower East Side of New York. And one of the things that we'll want to know is whether or not the Lower East Side represents a melting pot or a mosaic, or perhaps something of both. Let's get our bearings geographically. We're talking about New York, both as a state, one of the largest of the original 13 colonies, sometimes called the Empire State, whose eastern boundary conforms to the Atlantic coastal border of the United States, but whose western territories stretch well inland. When we think of New York, we often think of its famous city, New York City, which geographically speaking is to be found here down at the very toenail end of the Empire State. According to a graphic artist, what New York City might have looked like, well, before it was a city, while it was still in effect a native land devoid of the trappings of industrialization and modernization and colonization that Europeans would bring to it. Kind of a fun comparative perspective, you might say. When we think of New York City, we think of what the locals consider to be the 5 boroughs of New York City, and they include the Bronx and Brooklyn and Staten Island. But of the boroughs, the one that we're going to pay the most attention to here is perhaps the most famous of them, Manhattan. And you can see from the satellite photograph, Manhattan is an island. And it really sits at the heart of what we usually mean when we refer to New York City, surrounded on all sides by water, by the Hudson River, the Harlem River, the East River. Just about 22.96 square miles, that is under 23 square miles, in the middle of New York City, America's largest city. A nation within a nation was the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This is the particular landscape that we'll focus on today, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Now, you can see by this map, which shows New York City in the period of the 1920s, with its ethnic and racial neighborhoods, color-coded here for us, that idea of a mosaic really stands out. You have African American, Chinese, Czech, French, German, Irish, etc., and they all seem to occupy their own sort of discrete landscapes. The Lower East Side here, represented by Italian and mostly Jewish immigrants, as I say, will form the basis of what we're going to pay most attention to now. In fact, the Lower East Side was home to the largest Jewish immigrant population in the world by the early 1900s, what we'll call the Lower East Side. And the question is, were these immigrants looking to become American as they arrived in the 1890s and first decades of the 20th century? The Statue of Liberty welcoming the huddled masses certainly would have encompassed most of those who emigrated as Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, finding a home, many of them in the Lower East Side of New York City. Were they there to become Americanized, or were they there to preserve something of their heritage and identity from the old world? I love this picture because you can see perhaps something of both. To the right, we see immigrants, Russian Jewish immigrants, presumably who were recently arrived. Judging by their clothing, the head coverings the women wear, their style of dress, and even overcoats, the full beard, which the gentleman has, compares and contrasts with those immigrant folk who presumably have been settled maybe as shop owners, owners of a fish market, a bit more settled, longer residing in the Lower East Side, and apparently less obviously immigrant. So maybe a partial answer to our question is that it depended on how long one was here, and how and where and how successfully one assimilated as to whether the melting pot or mosaic was the preferred ideal. The Lower East Side was certainly transformed by the arrival of Russian Jewish immigrants and Eastern European Jewish immigrants in the 1890s. From 1881 to 1914, more than 2 million Jewish immigrants came to America, and about 1.25 million of them came to reside in the Lower East Side. Now get this, the Lower East Side, which we see here, represents only 1/80th of the total land space of New York City. And yet the population, the immigrant population, mostly immigrant population, represented 1/6 of New York City's total population. So 1/6 of the city's population living on just 1/80th of its land. And if you do the numbers here, that translates to about 700 people per acre. 700 people per acre. So a crowded landscape, as suggested by the picture here of Hester Street, one of the busiest and most vital of the thoroughfares in the Lower East Side. So crowded was it, in fact, that a new concept of urban real estate was fostered to accommodate the massive population, what was called the Dumbbell tenement, which was essentially a new form of high-rise residential structure, simple in design, typically 4 apartments per floor. Nothing fancy here: a bedroom, a living room, a parlor, a central or common bathroom, a public entry area. It was the tenements that took advantage of the landscape above, rather than claiming the always valuable landscape of terra firma, that is, of hard ground. The mostly poor immigrant people were stacked into the sky in the tenement apartments. As Jacob Riis put it, himself an immigrant and muckraking journalist, today 3/4 of its people live in the tenements, and the 19th century drift of the population to the cities is sending ever-increasing multitudes to crown them. J. William Youngs, an author of a textbook on America called American Reality, said the typical Dumbbell tenement had from 6 to 7 stories, each floor with 4 apartments containing a kitchen, a sitting room, and 1 or 2 bedrooms. So the basic standard of what becomes, in effect, the immigrant ghetto, the urban working class environment, the tenement apartment. Well, despite that it was stacked and crowded, the Lower East Side was also a place of tremendous energy and personality. As an immigrant neighborhood, the Lower East Side developed its own distinctive ethnic, cultural, and working class identity. Again, a nation within a nation. Take the language spoken by most of its inhabitants, for example. Yiddish itself was a kind of melting pot language, a hybrid of German, Hebrew, and other linguistic elements. And it had served in Eastern Europe to allow Jews from different quarters and different cultural and linguistic backgrounds to find a common language. It was a language shared and translated into the New World environment among Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side, many of whom came from, of course, different countries or regions of Europe where different languages are spoken. Yiddish gave them a common language. In that sense, it was a segregated landscape with an old world melting pot language. But you see, Yiddish was not spoken typically by those outside the Jewish quarters of the Lower East Side or other Jewish immigrant communities. And so it had the effect of becoming a kind of segregated language, a segregated American cultural landscape, stamped not only by the language but by the unique cultural profile of its immigrant people. Here you see the Podboreski family, for example, who lived in a small village in Lithuania and whose members would migrate, some of whom would migrate to the United States. Now this is before they left their native Lithuania. And we'll come back to them in a minute. The Podboreskis, as did many others in the Jewish immigrant migration, came from a region of Russia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland, which was called the Pale of Settlement. You see it marked on the map here. It was, in effect, a segregated land in the western part of the Russian Empire that was designated as a prescribed place of residence for all Jewish residents within the Russian Empire. Again, as Youngs, the historian, writes, they were usually not allowed to own land, meaning the Jews in Russia, and they were barred from higher education by restrictive quotas and tests. Early in the 19th century, Jews were drafted into the Russian army for 25-year periods of service and were expected to become Christians. And again, this gives us a clue as to the impulse for migration. Persecution based on cultural, religious identities, restrictive laws, and even the famous Russian pogroms, which were violent episodes carried out by the military, the Russian Tsar's military, against Jewish residents of Russia. The push factors, in other words, that drove immigrants to leave the Pale, when you combine those reasons with changing economic fortunes, you start to see a picture of a people determined to both preserve a sense of their identity and to recapture the opportunity for economic vitality. The migration to America. After 1890, many, having lost their traditional skilled labor jobs to industrial factories in Europe, joined the immigration stream to the United States. And again, this gives us a clue that folks were not necessarily coming to see themselves transformed, but to preserve who they were. And that had become increasingly difficult because of the harsh measures, legal and military measures taken against them. It became increasingly difficult to preserve their identities and, economically speaking, to preserve their independence. So what we have is the famous chapter of American history involving the huddled masses migrating via ship, usually 16 to 20 days voyage in crowded conditions. So many were coming in the 1890s that a federal government processing center was established in New York Harbor, what we know as Ellis Island, opened in 1892. Those arriving had to pass a medical test, make sure they weren't carrying contagious or infectious diseases, answer questions about their politics. There was suspicion, you might say, in the United States that foreign radical political ideas were like the contagious diseases, a threat somehow to America's democratic polity. And just generally have to answer questions about their politics, their money, their family situation, whether they knew anyone, whether they had someone to provide for them, to sponsor them, etc. And yes, sometimes European names were shortened upon processing and made more Anglo-sounding, which I guess gives us a bit of evidence to suggest, after all, a melting pot in this respect, as names became more Anglo-sounding, a first assimilation, you might say. Now back to the Podboreskis. Immigrants often followed what historians call chain migration. That is, they were preceded and or followed by family members and relatives, in effect stretching generations across time and space. Maybe if as a kid you watched Disney's Fievel, the American Tail movies, you had the sort of stereotypical view, albeit through the eyes of an immigrant mouse, the rather stereotypical view that America was this land of boundless opportunity and a kind of guilelessness among the immigrants, kind of innocence, expecting the streets to be paved with gold and that sort of thing. But in fact, because of chain migration, most immigrants had a relatively sober view, I think, of what they might expect in the United States. Among other things, they wrote letters back and forth. Here you see a letter handwritten in Yiddish from a father, Zev Podboreski, living in the Pale of Settlement still in Eastern Europe, and sent to his children living in America in the Lower East Side in 1910. Communication between a father and a daughter. Here was Rivka, the daughter, before she migrated to America. Father Zev never did migrate, but Rivka found work in a coat factory, sewing buttons. As we'll see, the textile industry was a big employer of immigrant laborers on the Lower East Side. In 1922, Rivka married Joseph Schuster, a Russian-born Jewish immigrant whom she met working at the clothing factory here in America. He spoke Yiddish, Russian, and German before learning his English, so they could have communicated from the beginning using one of a number of languages, but English was the last of the languages that they knew. But for their daughter, here you see here in 1942, their daughter Beatrice at age 18, English was of course her native language. And you can tell, I mean, if you read this sort of left to right, you can see from Rivka in Lithuania to Rivka and Joseph in America to their daughter Beatrice in 1942, a kind of process of cultural assimilation is occurring. And so maybe one thing we say about the melting pot is that it's a generational process involving generations of parents and children and grandchildren. From the 1890s to the 1910s, the Lower East Side was indeed a working class neighborhood, but it was a mix of working class occupations, both old world occupations. For example, Ephraim Lisitsky, a poet and writer from the Lower East Side, described his first day as a peddler, the most traditional of occupations. But that old world occupation existed side by side with the new industrial occupations. In 1890, the garment trade, as I mentioned before, employed 13,000 workers on the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side and its industrial quarters became the scene of one of America's great industrial tragedies. In fact, until September 11th, 2001, the Triangle Factory fire of 1911 was perhaps the greatest disaster in New York City history. 148 garment workers, most of them young female immigrants, died from a fire that broke out on the upper floors of what was a textile company, a factory located on the upper floors of one of the buildings of the Lower East Side, the Triangle Factory. Many of them died in the blaze or from smoke inhalation, others from jumping to escape the flames, dying on the sidewalk in the street below. So shocking was this event that it led to calls for reform, for workplace safety and the regulation of modern fire codes. In other words, it's one of those events that defines and precipitates the interest in reform that is characterized by the progressive era that we're reading about this week. Listen to the eyewitness testimony here. Horrified and helpless, the crowds, I among them, looked up at the burning building, saw girl after girl appear at the reddened windows, pause for a terrified moment, and then leap to the pavement below, to land as mangled, bloody pulp. This went on for what seemed a ghastly eternity. Occasionally a girl who had hesitated too long was licked by pursuing flames and, screaming with clothing and hair ablaze, plunged like a living torch to the street. Life nets held by the firemen were torn by the impact of the falling bodies. So a horrific scene that somehow combined together all the various themes of America in the progressive age, from industrialization to crowded urban tenement buildings to immigrant workers to calls for reform. I have included for this week under content a PBS video from a documentary on the Triangle Factory fire, and I encourage everybody to take a look at that. But despite the crowded conditions and the occasional tragic occurrence, visitors found that the Lower East Side, generally speaking, had quite an optimistic feel to it. As William Dean Howells, the American writer, recalled, I found them usually cheerful in the Hebrew Quarter. I was struck by men's heroic superiority to their fate, if their fate is hard. These days, we use the word ghetto typically in a context referred to kind of hip-hop culture, an African-American urban expression. But ghetto really has a longer history in America. It simply referred to any large, segregated, immigrant, urban community, such as the Lower East Side. So to speak of the Jewish Ghetto was simply to speak of a segregated landscape, urban landscape of mostly immigrant Jews who created their own culture, their own identity here in America. A combination, I guess we can say, of that mosaic and melting pot ideal. But there was something vital about the culture. And just as we recognize now the vitality and even the sort of popular cachet of, say, hip-hop as a urban ghetto cultural expression, we shouldn't be surprised to find other vital cultural expressions coming out of some of the, the most crowded, sometimes impoverished, really remarkable urban landscapes of the past. And certainly on the Lower East Side, there was a strong expression of culture. Yiddish theatrical productions were enormously popular among the Jewish immigrants who arrived in America between 1880 and 1925. This elaborate poster from 1897 heralds a series of star-studded productions at the Thalia Theatre, located in New York City's Bowery District on the Lower East Side. The Thalia was just one of 3 such theaters on the Lower East Side. We're going to come back to the tradition of Yiddish theater in a minute. Also on the Lower East Side were newspapers like the Jewish Daily Forward, which was founded in 1897 as a daily newspaper written in Yiddish. Letters written to the paper from the community often asked for advice. And let me excerpt this. "My dearest friends of the Forward, I have been jobless for 6 months now. I've eaten the last shirt on my back, and now there is nothing left for me but to end my life. Answer," from the editor. "This is one of hundreds of heartrending pleas for help, cries of need that we receive daily. The writer of this letter should go first to the crisis conference, and they will not let him starve. And further, we ask our readers to let us know if someone can create a job for this unemployed man." So the newspaper served as a kind of social network, as we might understand it today, for communication, for connection, for advice, and even social services. We see this vital culture emerge in the 20th century to help define America's mainstream culture, and the most famously in one of the most American industries, the motion picture industry. From the traditions of Yiddish theater came the great Hollywood studios of the golden age of Hollywood. MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Louis B. Mayer, and Sam Goldwyn, children of Russian Jewish immigrants. Hollywood's motion picture industry bore the imprint of their talent, and the talent belonging to America's immigrant Jewish population. The Warner Brothers studio was founded, again, by the children of Jewish immigrants. Douglas Fairbanks Sr., arguably the most popular actor of the golden age of Hollywood, and also the child of Jewish immigrants, was a founding member of United Artists as well as the Motion Picture Academy, and was recently featured at the inauguration in 2008 of President Barack Obama. Music played during the inauguration included that from the classic composition of Aaron Copland. You see Aaron Copland right here. Aaron Copland's classic composition of Appalachian Spring. Among the 3 musicians was Yitzhak Perlman, below, here, the great violinist, and himself a Jewish immigrant to the United States. Copland's music defines the classical composition of America in the 20th century, and Copland himself was born to Jewish immigrant parents in Brooklyn in 1900. It was for America and the American people that Copland created our first great classical compositions to rival those of the Old World, and the famous names that the European culture had produced. We had, as of yet, no Beethoven, no Bach, no Mozart. But we now had Aaron Copland, giving to Americans a distinctly American classical composition of music. And I'll put a piece, again under content, for week 6, so you can hear the amazing music of Aaron Copland. All right, so then a look at a unique cultural landscape, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a bustling, vibrant, busy, optimistic, striving nation within a nation that was both segregated and connected to America's larger culture. The complexity of America and its history of immigration is something that will concern us in lectures to come, and it will be an enduring thread throughout the semester as we seek to understand the ways this nation of immigrants has often defined itself in response to the challenges, the opportunities, and the pressures associated with immigration.